Okay, I'll go ahead and get started and people are joining and that's great. So hello everyone and thank you so much for joining us for our Race in the PR Classroom series. Today we're talking about how to incorporate diverse voices into the classroom. And it's presented by the Institute for Public Relations and the PRSA Educators Academy. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge our Asian and Pacific Islander colleagues, and also how hard it must be for professors of our Asian students after Tuesday's very tragic events. So that will be the topic of our next Race in the PR Classroom next month. So stay tuned for that. And if anyone wants to participate in that as a speaker, please let me know. Hi, I should say who I am. I'm Tina McCorkindale. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. And joining me today is Dr. Dean Mundy. Wave, Dean. He's the PR area director at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication and my partner in crime for these events. So today I'd like to welcome our fantastic host, Professor Nyree Wright. She's a PR lecturer at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communication and principal senior consultant at NQ Consulting. Nyree is presented at several of our events, and it's always great to see her and have her speak. And David Brown, who's the diversity advisor to the Office of the Dean and a professor at Temple University. And David has also been a great friend to IPR, and he also wrote a lessons earned that we can drop in the chat and check that out as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we're excited to dive into diverse voices. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules. This is Q&A type forum. You can ask a question, type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand virtually and then you can unmute and ask the question yourself. We want to make this interactive. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, you can type the message to the host in the chat or send it to Dean and we'll read your question aloud. Only the moderators can see your question, so it will be anonymous. We want this to be a safe space for people. If you are tweeting about this discussion, please use the hashtag RPRC. This discussion is being recorded and will be available for playback on the IPR website. Thanks to Nikki and her fast fingers. It's free and open to the public here, so feel free to share with all your networks. Also what our team does is we also gather all the links that are shared and resources, and those will be sent with the recording as well. Lastly, please remain respectful to our host and others on the call by keeping yourself muted when you're not speaking. Well, that's what I just said. Sorry, I was reading my notes and I was redundant with myself. So, but if you want to participate in next month's discussion, please let me know. That will be our last discussion of the academic school year, and then we'll resume again in the fall. So,
Tina, real quick, we have two more. We have one in April, one in May.
Sorry,
yes, sorry.
I forgot what month this was. April and May. Yes, sorry, this is March still through May, and then we go. Thank you, Dean, for always keeping me on track, which is not easy. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Nyree, and I'll give you the floor.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, David, you just bought yourself alive because I was about to come after you for leaving me here by myself.
And I know you mean that with all your heart. So I said, I better figure this out quick. My apologies, everybody.
How are you? How are you? Tina just turned it over to me and I was ready to do a dance, but now that I have my dance partner. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us today in this discussion. I know this is probably, I think, the third or fourth installment, Tina, of this series. And David and I are going to talk about specifically today how we've incorporated the book Diverse Voices, Profiles in Leadership. This is into our classroom. I am a professor or lecturer at the University of Florida. David has about 1,000 titles, and I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself in a second. But I currently joined the University of Florida. I can't believe it's been almost a year now, and turned the Diverse Voices class into a 3-credit course at the University of Florida. It was the first time that it was done. And this book, for those who are not aware of what the book is, this is an endeavor between the PRSA Foundation and the Museum of Public Relations. They published a book back in 2018 called Diverse Voices, and it profiles 43 PR practitioners of color and their experiences and their journey in the public relations and communications industry. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I am profiled in it, so I am a little biased, but David may make the cut for the second version. So we'll see, David, we'll see.
Don't throw no shade, don't throw no shade, it's all good.
So very happy to be here. Tina and team, thank you for putting this together. David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nyree. So, and again, my apologies, folks. Real quick explanation. My university migrated from a Google platform to a Microsoft platform overnight, and so I couldn't find anything. So I apologize for being late. But kind of to build on what Nyree has already said, I looked at the diverse voices from the perspective of the PRSSA Bateman competition back in 2019, and that was also part of the class. So what Nyree and I are going to probably do is we're going to kind of talk about how we incorporated it then, how we're incorporating it now, particularly as it relates to the moment in time we find ourselves, not just as an industry, but certainly as a country, and what we're trying to do in terms of moving forward, particularly under that rubric of race in the classroom, because this is something that we have been talking about for some time. We hope to be able to provide you all with some practical things. I'm also going to share an article that I wrote for PRSA Strategies that kind of looked at what our students can teach us about diversity, because there certainly is a hunger for that. And just quick in terms of my own background, so happy to be here in that I've been teaching at Temple for the last now 6 years. I also serve as a diversity advisor to the Office of the Dean of Klein College of Media and Communication. So I hope to bring some of that discussion to our time together. I also have some responsibility across the university, and we're connecting with a lot of other universities across the country who are trying to struggle with this. And I'm so glad, and thanks to Tina and her team for pulling this together. This is a very important conversation. And as you can see, Nyree and I talk very quickly, but we will be sure to watch the chat and still allow some time for our conversation. So I'll hand it back to you, Nyree, so you can get started on your portion, and I'll add some commentary as we keep going forward.
Thank you, David. And Tina, I don't know if you have a specific question or you just want me to talk a little bit just about the class in general. And...
Yeah, that would be great. Maybe talk about like what you're doing in the class and how it's set up and the different activities and how you take the book and make it into that. Yeah.
Sure. And I already saw in the chat that someone's looking to get a hold of my syllabus. We'll talk. But yes, I'm happy to share sort of the basics of the syllabus. So as I mentioned, Diverse Voices, actually the book launched in 2018, and then in spring of either fall of 2019, it was offered at the University of Florida as a 1 credit class, as an elective. And when I joined the faculty in August of 2020, we turned it into a 3 credit course. And, you know, I shared this with Tina and David on some previous calls that we've had together regarding this series. I could not have asked for a better moment in time to be teaching this class. So the book serves as the basis for the class. You know, obviously these anecdotes and stories and personal journeys that these practitioners took the time to share. Some of them are absolutely phenomenal. If you haven't gotten the book, I highly recommend that you do get it. Shameless plug. But even though I use it as the foundation, I've built upon it to include all the activities and events that have been happening in our industry surrounding DEI, specifically in the last 24 months, because all the PR folks that are on this call are well aware that DEI is something that has been an issue in the public relations and communications industry. We all can agree to that. The last 24 months prior to COVID, quite frankly, there has been more discussion and I believe more sincerity in trying to make the industry better as it relates to DEI. So being able to teach this course at this time, I have so much to choose from. So I have the book, then I have podcasts, and then I have articles, and then I have guest speakers. And I build it around the book, but I also build it around what's happening in our current time. And quite frankly, I'm going through trades. I'm going through regular media outlets, Business Insider, New York Times, Washington Post every day. I'm getting whiplash because I've got so many things to choose from to discuss with my students. And that's a great problem to have. And it's a lot to cram in, but they are learning pieces and aspects of D&I in our industry that they otherwise would not learn. And I try to make it as contemporary as possible, because let's be honest, these are young people. It takes a lot to hold their attention. By the time they've gotten to me, they've already had principles in PR and writing, and most of them had campaigns and things of that nature. So by the time they get to my class, they've already have had that foundation of the actual industry. So when we talk about DEI and how it relates to this industry, it takes it a step further. And quite frankly, a lot of what we discuss and embark upon are tools and practical applications they can use beyond the industry. I do my best, and I wish I had a student on here to co-sign, but I create a safe space for my students to have these discussions. And I think that's very important for people to know. I teach at the University of Florida, ladies and gentlemen. It's a majority white institution, okay? And I'm talking about DE&I to a class that is 80% white. So these discussions they're hard, they're challenging, but I set it up from the door that it's a safe space, and that any question or any topic that they want to broach, this is the place to bring it. And quite frankly, I have been honored to get the candor and the honesty and transparency from these students who have real questions and real concerns that they have not had in other classes thus far. So I'll pause there, David. I'll turn it over to you and talk about your experience.
Thanks, Nyree. And because there's actually some great ways to kind of connect back into this. So while Nyree has looked at the class itself in terms of the diverse voices as a class, we use diverse voices. We were introduced to it, of course, through the Bateman competition in 2019. And let me build on some of the things that she has shared already, because she's absolutely right. It does require a certain level of maturity in terms of our students to be able to articulate some of these things. For most of us, and Temple is also a predominantly white institution, that being able to have the language to do this, it is what we are looking at as a university is not just a class for diversity or diverse voices in particular, but we're trying to develop a curriculum across all throughout their course of study to make them to be more diverse in terms of their thinking, more proficient in an increasingly inclusive, hopefully, and equitable world. That takes some time, that takes some discussion, that takes some work, and not just in just a diverse class, because what we found is that when you put diversity as your subject heading, certain folks will say, well, that's not for me. Other folks may feel uncomfortable doing it. And that gets to a little thing that Nyree and I kind of talked about as a prep before this. Not every instructor is equipped to really feel comfortable to dive into guiding these conversations, because let's face it, folks, some of our instructors, like some of us that were even on some of our calls, are not yet ready to dive into having those discussions. So part of what we've done, in addition to the classes that we teach, we developed a course called Can We Really Talk, which is a faculty-focused course of study. It's just more like a workshop. It's not really a course that enables folks to be able to have different language, different how to articulate that. Nyree mentioned about how to have safe space. How do you create that? Because we know safe space is something that's determined not by the instructor, but by the participants in the class. Do they feel safe enough to have these kind of conversations? And very honestly, some of us may not even feel safe to have these conversations around our kitchen table. So we need to kind of figure out how best can we use that. But also, as Nyree had mentioned, where do you go for these resources? And I completely agree with Nyree in terms of what a time to be teaching this. And I say that with all sincerity, in that we've got stuff that's happening on a daily basis. And Nyree had mentioned, I don't know if she's going to talk about it later, about using an incident that happened at Google, as she's so some of this has to have some degree of fluidity to kind of recognize there's some things that are happening like right now. And I think the other thing too is that, when we look at the students who are in these classes, which I know that Nyree will also echo this thought, is that they are hungry for this. We did there's research that's out there that shows the students that we're teaching right now are not only hungry for diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're looking for organizations to join who are demonstrating diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we know that a lot of times our students are going to be on the entry level, having a passion for the work, but being able to be having these types of conversations and these types of classes enables them to be able to be better advocates, better champions, if you will, for diversity, equity, inclusion. And so we know that, and we are all working as part of a profession to make our profession change the complexion so it is more diverse, more equitable, and inclusive. However, these folks who are going into these jobs now are going in as the aspirational practitioners that we hope they will be, to be both advocates, accomplices, as well as our allies. And an accomplice, we want to make that distinction, is someone who's willing to go to jail with you to make some things happen. And we have all three levels in terms of some of those things. The last thing I'll say, then I'll hand it back to Nyree, because I know we want to talk a little bit more about the curriculum itself. And that is, when we try to equip our students with things like this, we have to recognize, just as educators and practitioners, that this is not a destination-driven kind of thing. This is a journey. Some of us are learning this as we go. Some of us are way ahead in terms of where we are. So it's going to take more than just a book and a discussion, just more than just a YouTube look and a discussion. This should be something that we practice on a regular basis in terms of being able to implement some of the things that we're talking about in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion as a curriculum. And then the last thing I'll say, Nyree, at Temple, we have developed a course called Diversity and Media Issues in Public Relations, which again, similar to what Professor Wright said, is a higher level. It's a 3,000, 4,000 level course. It is required. And I love the fact that even though it is required, we recognize that diversity, equity, and inclusion has many different forms. It's sexual identity, it's gender, it's intersectionality. It's a lot of different things that have to be taken into consideration. So when we look at this type of curriculum, every student that we teach it to can find their place within a diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. Back to you, Nyree.
Thank you, David. Tina, do you have anything specific you want to jump in on? Or you want me to just keep going?
I'm turning it over to Dean Mundy. He's in charge. I'm abdicating my responsibilities.
I'm in charge of the question. So actually, I had a couple of questions sort of to piggyback on both of your comments. If that's okay, we can sort of steer it that direction with you. So I guess Nyree, the question for both of you would be something that I've been curious about. And David, you touched on this a little bit in terms of the students and who's taking the classes, because I always worry that the students who need to be taking the classes are not taking the class. So, so what are you seeing in terms of the students who sign up for it? And that's one question. The other would be, and David, you referenced this a little bit in terms of how do these courses fit into the broader curriculum, and completely different topics, but whichever one you want to take on.
Sure. Nyree, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how because you're now seeing a much larger enrollment than when you started. So I definitely want you to touch on that. And then I can just very quickly say, in terms of for us, a lot of it, just like any course, depends on the instructor, right? Someone's like, oh, Professor Brown is teaching that. This could be interesting, right? So, and again, we're talking about kids who are like, okay, they can pick and choose. So that's one thing. But the other point you made, Dean, in terms of making it mandatory, we have to try to do that so it doesn't feel punitive. So it doesn't feel like when folks who may not identify themselves as being diverse think that, well, this is not for me, or I'm going to be shamed in this type of, that is we have a lot of control and responsibility, quite honestly, as instructors, to go back to what Nyree mentioned before about safe space, valuing every conversation, every perspective, even those that may be counter to what we may personally think as instructors, because we have to recognize that we are building or helping at least our students to build their own ideological perspectives. And we have to recognize, I'll say this in full disclosure, at Temple University, and we've got all types, right? So folks who for the first time, and we hand this off because I don't want to tread on Nyree's time, but we talked before about in these type of classrooms, we've had tears that are shed. We've had revelations that happen. I have had a student who identifies as East Asian, and for the first time in this class saw herself as being diverse. And then a lot of things that she had been not consciously denying, but was just denying it and just broke down and cried in the classroom. I think that those types of revelations can be breakthroughs and teaching moments as we continue to move some things forward, because of recognizing that a lot of our students are going to be dealing with a lot of these issues for the very first time. Go ahead, Nyree.
Yeah, so Dean, to your point about who's taking the class, I had a very small group last semester, and I am going to assume, because I'm new, David, to your point, it was like, who is this Nyree Wright on this syllabus teaching this diverse voices? And I quickly learned from my students that they have their own system of figuring out who they want to take for a class. So I learned as much from them as they do from me. So I had a class of about 10 or 11 students, and I had literally sort of a rainbow, a Black female, Black male, white male, Latino, LGBTQ male, a couple white students. I mean, it was a significant mix just amongst those 10 students. This semester, I have 27. And I will take credit that word spread on how good the class was. So I have 27 students this semester, and they're out of that class, 20 are white female. Now, there's a couple things that speak to that. We all know in the industry, it's 70 to 75% female in any given time. I mean, that number fluctuates. And we need to talk about that as an industry too, just how female the public relations industry has become. That's another discussion for another day. But, and then I have a couple Asian Americans. I have, I think, 2 Latinas. So it's majority white. And this topic for many of them, and I learned this from my last class, and I'm seeing it happening in this class. And Nikki, if you can queue up the video I asked you to queue up, that would be great. I'm learning from them what they expected from the class and then what they actually got out of the class. So they come into this class, they see it on paper, they see that the book costs, $15. They're excited that it's not a $100 textbook that they can't resell. Let's start there. And then they're actually forced to read this book. About a third of their grade is based on their engagement in discussion with the book, or their engagement in discussion in the class. They are not allowed to turn off their cameras. You are getting graded on your proactive engagement in the discussions that we're having. And so what I was learning, particularly last semester, is sort of this morphing into just other topics that leap from the book, right? And I mentioned before, whether it's podcasts or articles or news of the day that have come out. But I had no idea the impact, and it brought me to tears. The last assignment for the class is a video reflection, and I had each student do a 3 to 5 minute video telling me what you thought you were going to get this out of this class, and then what you got out of this class. And I had they all were great, but one particular student who was a white male gave just such an authentic and just wonderful perspective. And Nikki, if you can play that for everyone, I'd like to share that with you. David, I'm just going to drop the mic there. I'm going to turn it over to you. Guys, the video says it all. I don't really can't say anything. It's just that I even get choked up every time I see it. Because this is real. And our students, to hear this from Noah, it was just, it did so much for me, and lets me know I'm in the right space and in the right time to foster these conversations among, as you can tell, some of the brightest students in the world. UF has them, and I'm lucky to have just a small cadre of them. So thank you, Nikki, for playing.
Yeah, I agree with Nyree. I mean, that definitely is a drop the mic moment. And I'm so glad when we were talking about, what we would share, how emotional this could be and can be for the folks that we are trying to impact, and including on us. And I'm going to put in the chat, kind of like the reality of kind of like where we are in terms of our students can teach us a great deal if we're willing to learn. It is very much kind of looking at what are some things that we can learn while we're teaching. That is, I think, critical. And I think what you heard in the comments that were shared is that we have to kind of recognize that a lot of our students have this healthy dose of skepticism about what they think they know and what they think they can learn. And so I think that being able to at least understand that. And also to recognize, kind of back to Dean's point about even measuring that. And I'm not trying to get it into the granular, it's like, okay, proficiency A gets to proficiency B, but this is something, particularly with the students, going to last that person a lifetime, and we're also not completely from a blank canvas, and that everybody's coming to these conversations in these classrooms with their own, set of sensibilities and exposures and so forth. And what you'll see, this article that I'm dropping in, I wrote with my colleague Gina Laughlin, kind of looks at the diverse voices. When we looked at kind of peeling that apart as part of the Bateman competition, we learned a lot from those 66 entries that what students think about stuff like this. And so this kind of gets back to Dean's point about when you make it mandatory. Well, Bateman's not necessarily mandatory for a lot, but it's like, well, this is the client. And this is going to be our reality. You heard this student say in the video, like, I'm not planning to go into public relations, still planning to be a human being though, right? And how then do you function as a human being in an increasingly diverse, equitable, and inclusive world? So looking at that, if you look at that article, just I'm going to quickly give you the highlights. I know we're going to have even more questions. You'll see that 66 entries, but no HBCU submitted one. So we got to kind of, what voices are missing from this conversation? Even in the video, what the student had mentioned is like, you're going to get some, what he says, you're going to get some jerks. I'll just kind of use that. And that's okay, because you're going to have, even whether you're going into the academy or you're going into industry, there will still be people who says, like, racism is over. Okay, well, not really. So we need to figure out how then can we continue to be effective academicians and effective practitioners in these types of spaces. The other thing, just very quickly, in the article that we looked at, in terms of looking at all 66 of those entries, how you define diversity is very important, because that can also help you to do some things that are measurable, not just kind of checking the box, but looking at proficiency. I think that's very important. But also, just as Nyree mentioned, having these different types of resources does not necessarily mean that people will access those resources. One of the things that we looked at is that there's a ton of things that are available through PRSA, through IPR, that is out there, modules, you name it. But just because they're in the garage don't mean you're going to drive it off the lot, right? So we have to think about what are some of the things that we're using, and we also have to be discerning in terms of our own use of some of this information, because if it's not good, just like the student said, like edition number 13, because they changed a word and it's boring. I think that this, at least from my perspective, having taught some of this, is how nimble are we as instructors to incorporate what's happening like right now. So as a very quick example, someone's teaching public relations theory on Thursday, and our kids who are coming into our classrooms want to talk about the massacre that happened in Atlanta 2 days ago, and they're not present, even though their bodies may be, physically on Zoom, but they want to talk about that. And as Nyree mentioned, some of our students get more and more comfortable with us as instructors and saying, hey, listen, can we talk about this? Because that does, forget about the asymmetrical model in terms of what we're trying to teach. They may want to talk about some of this stuff right now, and how can we use these things as teaching moments? Again, that is being flexible and fluid enough to know that, okay, I know what you're probably thinking, so let's talk about this, and how can we relate that to what might be on chapter 4 in terms of our textbook. So being able to do that becomes very, very important. The last thing I'll say, and I'll hand it back over to Dean, is that this gathering, even today, look at this gathering as a research and resource connection, because some of us are doing it and saying, hey, now I'm going to look up some of the stuff that Nyree mentioned today, because I know that I need to have more tools in my toolkit to be able to teach some of this stuff. Or even having a conversation like, what, I got to talk about this thing about, George Floyd. That thing is going to happen. The trial is going to happen. May 31st, we may be done our semester. That's going to be in the news cycle every week leading to the end of the semester. If we haven't thought about how we might be able to talk about those things, there are people on the Zoom right now who can help us to think through this. I also saw, just real quick, on the Hollywood Squares box, I saw Hillary Cisco, who's on this. She developed a module as part of Diverse Voices that we have used. It's a very good model, So you need to have something to start somewhere, just as folks asked in the chat about sharing syllabi. Definitely let's look at how we might be able to share some of those resources. And I think there's been some discussion about a repository. And I know that the Planck Center, for example, has a great, through Dr. Kay Sweetser, has a great speakers bureau that now in the time of Zoom, we can pull people in who can speak with credibility, who are living some of this stuff, to provide some more resources to some of us in our classrooms to be able to teach through the diversity, equity, inclusion space.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Actually, could I piggyback on that just a little bit? And actually Noah's video, brought this question to the forefront that I've been thinking about a lot. As we, God willing, go to the post-Zoom era, and we return in some way to in-class, I keep trying to think about, and I know we all are, like, what do we keep? What do we return to? And I worry that we're going to lose some of the power that we've been able to discover this past year in terms of different types of assignments. I know a lot of my students have opened up to me in more sincere ways over this past year than ever before, because the technology, I don't know, allows that, and these video reflections allow that. And so could you talk a little bit, and Professor Wright, I'll start with you, in terms of, have you thought about with this class or a similar class with it, like, what are some assignments that you want to keep in the virtual space versus returning to the classroom, and thinking to next year?
Great question. I'm not doing assignments based on the class being virtual. Virtual is sort of just the logistics aspect of the class. The topics that we cover, the podcasts that we listen to, the speakers that we have, the articles that are assigned, I would be doing the same thing. It's really, to David's point, it's about the timeliness. These issues are contemporary. And David brought up the point about, what happened in Atlanta a couple of days ago. I had a speaker in my class for today. If I didn't have a speaker in my class, I am sure we would have brought up what happened in Atlanta, because I have 3 Asian American students in my class. And we've been comfortable enough to talk about these issues. One of the assignments that we had just last week was listening to a podcast with Steve Barrett of PR Week and Gail Hyman, who's the president of Weber Shandwick, a podcast from June 5th, 2020. This was about a week or two after George Floyd. And what was said at that point in time, and the thinking that was happening at that point in time versus 9 months later, and what the students are seeing, what they have seen based on that podcast, what they're seeing in the industry today, what they're hearing, what they're observing. And this was during the same week that the settlement happened for George Floyd. So I try to tie in all those pieces. And I would do the same thing if we were in person. They would just get to see me in all my loveliness, close up. But all of it really is the content that I have. And if I can just touch on that for a second, Dean. So I have a sort of a combo of things. I have speakers. I do the podcasts and articles. I have, and like for these speakers, for example, all my speakers are diverse. Last semester, I had the head of social media and content for Volkswagen, an Asian American gentleman named Patrick Foe. I had Tracy Blunt, who's an African American female. She's head of corporate communications for the NFL. I had Travis Parman, who is a white male, very staunch supporter and member of the LGBTQIA+ community. He was head of Nissan, but now he's head of communications at App Harvest. So they're getting these perspectives of these professionals who are living this day to day. That has been a huge, it's made a huge impression upon my students. The feedback I get from them is tremendous. And then I also veer off outside of the industry. And David, you hit it spot on. We had a podcast called Inclusion by Design. It was sponsored by Power to Fly. And Power to Fly is an organization basically that connects women to tech. And this particular podcast, it discussed sort of all the things that you need to do in order to have an inclusive an inclusive environment and a productive environment for women in particularly, but women and people of color. And it discussed the data and strategies required to build more diverse and inclusive workplaces. And it was a panel of these amazing behavioral scientists and communications people and tech women. And it combined insights from economics and psychology to improve decision-making in organizations and society, and had all sorts of gender and cross-cultural perspectives. And it sounds complicated, but it really isn't. What it did, it gave the class the opportunity to see how this is playing in every space. This is not just PR. This is happening in every industry. And we all know that tech in particular lacks gender and race equity across the board in terms of access, in terms of business, et cetera. So I know I kind of went on a tangent, but it really, to your original question, I just look at the content that we have. And if, we're doing it virtually now, that's fine. But when we're in the classroom, I mean, I'm just excited to bring in, 3D materials. Now I can actually bring in arts and craft, and I'm an artsy person. So I'll sort of, jazz it up a little bit. But it really wouldn't affect the content. I will agree that the one-on-one that I've had with my students, because they're home and they're in a safe space. When I have my one-on-ones, I have 3 pregnant girls in my class this semester. 3. They all came to me with different story, has nothing to do with the class. But they were late with an assignment, and that led to, okay, well, how can I help you get your assignment in? It leads to a whole other perspective, because we are in a pandemic. This isn't just we all went to Zoom. Look at the circumstances surrounding why we are in this environment. So this is going to go beyond the classroom. This is really the relationships and the bonding that's happening. And this is my first year teaching, and I'm teaching virtually. So my expectation is high. I'm ready to go in the classroom and be like, what's up, y'all? Here I am. Like, keep that party going. But we are in a very unique time, and I'm taking full advantage of it, because it really has given me the aptitude and the skills needed to build those relationships with my student and get that trust in order for us to have these conversations.
And if I can build on 3 quick points. And first of all, everybody look at the chat, because there's some great stuff going on, but Nyree hit on some really, really important points, but 3 in particular I wanted to emphasize. Number one, back to his question about technology, definitely is great, because we are having access to more people than we would not have had otherwise, flying people in or just pulling people from our own market. But I think what is so important that Nyree had mentioned is that we're not just trying to showcase diverse professionals who are working in diverse spaces. They are diverse people who are working in a range of different spaces. So it's not the director of ethnic marketing, director of marketing. It's not we're just trying to sell Volkswagens to people who identify a sexual identity. We're talking about every consumer. And that is very, very important to look at. Let us not let our students get pigeonholed into a certain mode of thinking. The second point I was going to make is that recognize that in our classrooms, we really have to be very careful about not making those folks in our classrooms the experts or having them to speak for. I think Nyree's point is so well taken, because we have a lot of students who identify as Asian in our classes. I don't want to put them on the spot to say, what do you think about this? Because that's unfair to them. So it's like we have to kind of make sure that we're finding ways to provide not only safe space, people will jump in when they're ready to, but pulling them in can be very, very traumatic and very, very dangerous. So I just put that out there as something to consider. So, we don't want to be able to kind of, the consequence of trying to do good is not always going to have a good outcome. So that's very, very important. The third thing that I would say, though, is kind of look at, what are we trying to ultimately do, right? This is going to be, like I said, we have to take this, elephant one bite at a time. It's not going to happen all at once. It's not going to happen. It may not even happen over a 15-week semester, but getting it started is very important. And providing space to continue those conversations, I think, is also very important, because it will equip our students to be better at doing this. And the expectation that we have as practitioners and academicians, that the more students that are coming will also want to be better equipped. So just the same way we're trying to help students develop their writing, developing their proficiency in the diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to be another foundational skill that they're going to have to be able to have. And I would also say, coming out of an environment like Temple, that is right in the heart of an urban environment, my expectation as both an employer and a professor is like, look, you're coming out of Temple, I'm expecting some things from you. If you're coming out of Columbia, I'm expecting some things from you. If you're coming out of University of Florida, I'm expecting some things from you. And we have to make sure that we can help them continue to meet those expectations.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Before I could talk all day and ask questions, but before I ask another question, I want to open it up to everybody else. If anybody has questions. There's a lot of chat going on in the chat, so I will let you do that. I was in a meeting the other day where somebody actually was reading everything word for word. I was like right there. So I'll let y'all get into it. So I have more of a technical question while we wait for people to ask. And if you could both speak to this. So Professor Wright, you grew this class from 1 credit to 3 credits. So if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of like, what that looked like of, starting out, okay, there's demand here, let's grow this. And then you also mentioned that, by the time the students are taking it, they've had principles, they've had some of the foundational courses. So if you and David, if you could talk about this too, like where does it fit within the curriculum? Is there a certain number of prereqs, or do you just do students tend to just come in with those prereqs? Or like if you were going to put a course in like this, and I'm asking partly selfishly because one of our requirements is the special topics, and we're going to start having regular rotations, and we've had this question of what kind of prereq. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Wright, to start. Oh, you're muted, I believe. Yeah.
Sorry about that. There are prerequisites for the class. I don't know them off the top of my head, and I apologize. But there are prerequisites. All of my students are juniors or seniors also. And they're juniors and seniors, but most of them are seniors. So they're about to graduate. And a piece of that's sort of strewn throughout the entire semester are also practical applications that they can use to get a job, right? At the end of the day, these students are, and I'll give you a perfect example. We had a very spirited conversation, quote unquote, regarding internships. And I apparently opened Pandora's box because my students went in and they were just, I did not realize how much of an issue of paid internships versus non-paid internships and the experiences that they're having, the shitty experiences, quite frankly, that they're having, the expectations that are being, cast on them. And it surrounded this whole discussion about internships and fellowships and then looking for a job. And then we ended up talking about negotiating. I'm actually having a mocktail hour tomorrow called The Right Way to Negotiate. Because they have and granted, they're students, so of course they haven't had any jobs per se, but just the whole notion of negotiating was completely foreign to this class. Like what they need to look for when they're looking for that job, what baseline of pay, how, if they have multiple job offers, how do you sort of put one against the other, and how you tell one job and keep them on ice as you're figuring it out. All these little things that they're just not told. And so there's not a curriculum for that. There's not a class that says these are sort of the practical things you need to know to go out and get a job. So I sort of weave it in different ways throughout the semester. And it seems to be very helpful. And I think, David, you had mentioned this before. At this age and at this level in their college education, they're hungry. They're hungry for the info. They're hungry for the guidance. And they're front and center and they're present, and that, they're a captive audience. And so the more we can impart to them, like, not just the fundamentals and not just the basics, which are very important. They need to learn how to write. The assignments I give them, you get points taken off if you have a misspelling, if you have one misspelling, because you're a junior and senior, you have spell check. You have all these other apps. If you can't take 5 minutes to check your 30 seconds to check your paper, then you're in the wrong class, because you need to know how to write. You need to know how to pitch. You are going into PR. If you are not talking about earned media in every single class, quite frankly, in some form or fashion in your PR classes, where PR, your bread and butter, is earned media, that's a problem. So because I'm coming from the professional side of this as well, I've got all of this in me. So it's very easy for me to impart, but it's something I'm noticing just how hungry they are for those basics, because they're all graduating and they need a job.
Yeah. 3 quick points to build on what Nyree has already mentioned. One, about the level. I agree completely. Maturity matters. So being able to look at that. So there are some prereqs in terms of just based on level. You can't take a 3,000 course unless you finish, 1,000, 2,000. So some of those. However, I don't want to let us off the hook in those intro classes, because when we teach intro to public relations, and if we're still teaching that the founding fathers, and that's gender as well as kind of like a racist kind of construct, there are some great resources that are out there. Give a shout out to Dr. Denise Hill from Elon University, and some of the work, and the museum, PR Museum has some great stuff that looks at other people of color who have done things during the same time, Edward Bernays, Ivy Lee, and all the others, and how to then teach that. So from that perspective, that helps. The second point I'm going to make in terms of upper level is that for most of us and most of our universities, a lot of our students come to public relations late. They come in, they came from the business school, they came from medical school. It's like, I heard about this PR thing, let me jump in. So, okay, here it is. So being able to kind of connect with them at that level, that also provides a very important kind of inflection point, if you will, in their own development as college collegians, right? So that's very important. The third thing that I wanted to say, just quickly kind of responds a little bit to the question that Tara Smith had posed in terms of assessments, because what Nyree had mentioned before, in terms of how you do this, certainly writing well and so forth, but we would make a big mistake if we do just a multiple choice. So who is Nyree Wright? Who is, because now we just have names, but not necessarily connections. So being able, one of the assignments that we provided, and I, again, go back to Dr. Sisko's piece in terms of the companion piece to diverse voices, asks you to develop some of those skills to go find someone in your market who you identify as diverse. And then I need you to tell me what makes them, from your perspective, diverse. So you're going to have to do a little bit of homework, develop those research skills, develop a connection that you might not otherwise have. And for us at the very end of the course, being able to articulate what is diversity, what is equity, what is inclusion, so you know. And I can consider myself an expert only because this is what I'm doing. If it's kind of way off, but you can defend it, okay, let's see you defend that. And so I think that there's clearly some ways that could be very meaningful in terms of assessing whether or not our students are getting what we're trying to teach them.
Great, thank you, David. And actually, to continue with Tara's question, Professor Wright, are there any other assessments that you found successful in your class?
In terms of how I grade them, or what was the question? I'm so sorry.
That's right. I'll turn it over to Tara if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sorry. I appreciate so much everything that you both have said. This has been wonderful. I was just curious at the type of assignments, because I love that you did that video reflection essay. I have found something like that to be helpful in a course I'm teaching now, but I was just curious other ideas for a course like this and topics like this. To David's point, I don't want to just give someone a quiz. I would like to make sure there's that critical thinking happening. So I was just curious if you had any other examples.
Sure. And my boss is on the line. So at risk of my employment, I do not give quizzes in my class. I do not give quizzes. I do not give tests. I give reading assignments, discussion, feedback. This is a very qualitative type of course. Okay. So having said that, because we're PR junkies, the news is our best friend. So a perfect example, David alluded to this earlier in the conversation. My diverse voices class is on a Tuesday and Thursday. The day after my Tuesday class, it was in the news, the Google article that came out that I'm sure many of you saw, and it got picked up everywhere, that Google had, it was revealed that Google HR was giving counsel to employees to take health and mental leave if they complained of any sexism or racism happening in the workplace. Okay, I'll pause there. So The assignment was, so I saw that article, I was like, ooh, perfect timing. So in time for class, it was an in-classroom assignment. Read this article, and then, and it's a 50-minute class time. And so the article took just a few minutes to read. Read the assignment, read the article. Your assignment is to put your Google PR team member. The assignment is for you to draft a memo to the execs of Google, the Google execs. You're on the PR team. You are to draft a memo to the execs, giving them, quote, food for thought, end quote, meaning giving them guidance and counsel on what they should include in a PR statement based on this scenario and based on what you've learned in this class thus far. What kind of pieces of information do you want to share with them in order for them to make a thoughtful and respectful response and statement about this matter? So you're not the PR person writing the piece, you're the actual counselor giving them food for thought. All these things that we've talked about, microaggressions and unconscious bias and diversity fatigue and all these different scenarios. How would you counsel them in responding on this matter? And the essays have been fantastic. And of course, it was 250 words, double spaced, Arial 10 font, spelling, I spell it out. So you have no questions. So when you get a point taken off, you know why. But so it's very specific, but they love the fact that it happened like that day. And this was, and obviously it's, we as PR practitioners would even have, find that kind of assignment quite daunting, right? But they rose to the occasion. And I will tell you, some of the memos I got were fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And I would challenge that probably wouldn't happen in another class. So I hope that's helpful to you, Tara. But again, the timeliness of these topics, because these are young people, and their attention span is like this. I'm not really talking about things that were 3 years ago. There are some institutional pieces like articles from IPR, PRSA, and things of that nature. But the fact that I have this arsenal of everyday issues that they can actually look up on TikTok or look up on their social media outlets is priceless.
That was so helpful. Thank you so much again for sharing. That is an amazing assignment. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that I love that assignment. That's great. I think unfortunately I'm loving this conversation, but I think we're at time, and so I'm going to turn this over to Tina again. Thank you both so much.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Wright and Professor Brown. We really appreciate it as always. Just to note that we are going to send the resources that are in the chat, and we'll send those out in the next day or two. And then save the date on your calendar for the next Race in the PR Classroom, which will be on April 15th at 12 p.m. Eastern is when we typically do it, but we're just finalizing our speakers. I know that Dr. Juan Ming will join us, and we will talk about allies and support for AAPI students, especially as we've seen the events of the past year. So thank you all for a great discussion, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.